A very good Friday afternoon to all of you, and welcome to Christchurch Cathedral. I first want to just acknowledge that we gather here on the ancestral territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, and we do so in the spirit of ongoing reconciliation and truth-telling. Welcome to Christchurch Cathedral for this 7th concert in the Emily Carr String Quartet Beethoven series. My name is Mark McDonald. I'm the Assistant Director of Music here, and I welcome you on behalf of our Dean and Director of Music, Donald Hunt. For a list of our up-to-date COVID protocols, which I see that you're all doing very, very well today, you can find those in your leaflets. I'll just, of course, remind everyone that we continue to wear masks indoors, and we maintain social distancing, which I see is all happening at the moment. And the one thing that I do have to ask, sadly at this time, is that we have to leave the concert immediately following, so we can't stay around in the space. But you're welcome to chat with your neighbors outside. As we get into a busy fall season of music making, I'd like to draw your attention to a couple of events that are coming up here at the Cathedral. Beginning at the end of September is a new series. We're pleased to be partnering with Early Music Vancouver for their Passports series. The series kicking off with Mandinka Pilgrimage on September 25th, and this features the world-renowned kora player Ablai Kisoko. And this is going to be an amazing concert with Ensemble Constantinople from Montreal. So I highly recommend it. Tickets are available on Eventbrite. Just search for the concert title or go to the Pacific Baroque website, pacbaroque.org. We are fortunate at this cathedral to have so many wonderful partnerships, and it's been such a pleasure over the past few months here for this series, but also for the several series that we've now done with the Emily Carr String Quartet. And I'm delighted once again to be able to hear some wonderful Beethoven string quartets today. I will also draw your attention to the next concert in the series. You can see that in your program. It's October the 8th. And then finally after that, there's only one more left, so we're nearly all the way through. To introduce us to the quartets on today's concert, which are quite substantial, and I'm looking forward to hearing about them, I would like to welcome now Robert Holliston to give us a little bit of a briefing. Here we go.
Thank you very much. It's a wonderful opportunity to hear these amazing pieces. Of all the things that you're going to hear, I think, in the whole series, this is the concert. You're going to hear, first of all, what is arguably the most innovative, far-reaching, puzzling, baffling, but exciting piece that Beethoven wrote. A single movement that was just described by Igor Stravinsky as being eternally contemporary. You're also going to hear the last complete movement of music that Beethoven wrote before he passed away. So although this is considered quartet number 14 out of 16, it includes a movement that he wrote pretty much after everything else was complete. And it is a confounding thing to look at what I'm going to describe as late period Beethoven. In this, we have to assume that Beethoven didn't know until perhaps shortly before the event that he was going to die when he did. But it just so happens that he manages to have summarized, as if he were some kind of celestial valedictorian, everything that could be said about the piano sonata, everything that could be done with the symphony, and finally everything that could be done with the string quartet at the end of his life. I'm always a little bit concerned when I'm looking at a sea of really familiar faces, and I'm going to be repeating myself, so forgive me in advance if I do. But someone said, oh, that's all right, I never remember what you say anyway. So a little bit of a review of what late Beethoven actually means. At no point in Beethoven's life, we may assume, did he wake up and think, oh my goodness, obviously I'm going into my middle period. Historians seem to think that that's how he lived, but that, of course, isn't how he lived. That's how we perceive his life when we have had enough distance that we can look at it somewhat objectively. But of course, Beethoven had entered a world in which he could not really hear the practical consequences of what he had put onto the page. I think we run the risk of overestimating how much that affected his composition, because he was always an interior composer. He always wrote in his head. He did work out details of the compositional process in his notebooks, and we can see them. But as he said himself, it's all up here anyway. And he didn't necessarily need to hear it. And I think some of us need to be reminded from time to time that it may have, in fact, been somewhat liberating for him, because certainly the music he wrote in the period we call the late period is profoundly further reaching than anything he had written before. Even if we can trace the early Beethoven to the late Beethoven, it's as if he's reaching beyond anything he had ever done before. So a few of the little things that you'll hear in this piece that are characteristic of late Beethoven: an almost obsessive preoccupation with trills and what trills can do with the music. A little ornamental gesture that we had heard in the earlier part of the classical era and in the Baroque, something that was like a Christmas tree ornament, becomes an actual thing. It goes from being parsley to being the main dish, and it can have the effect of having a melody float away into the ether. And Beethoven will use trills in a way that really nobody ever had before. Also, a preoccupation with counterpoint and fugue that probably coincides with his exercise in studying Handel and Bach, both composers he came to admire and love very much. And boy, are you ever going to hear the ultimate fugue today. And with that, I'll also mention his increased use of chromaticism and dissonance. Not only in the Grosse Fuge, the very, very famous evocation of modernity, but in the Opus 130 quartet as well, there are passages that feel that they could have been part of the second Viennese school, the school of Schoenberg, the school of Berg, certainly the Reger. It feels like Beethoven is expanding the language of tonal music as far as it can go. He will experiment with genres, but it's important to remember this is not a romantic composer. This is a hugely advanced classical one. He never abandons the established classical genres. And in instrumental music, those are the piano sonata, the symphony, and the string quartet. Coincidentally, not the last things that he grappled with. You're going to learn a word today, a German word I hadn't heard either till I started looking up details about Opus 130. But he will put an incredible premium on the power of music to express emotion and express feeling. And in his experimental gestures with familiar structures, we are used to hearing in a sonata cycle a fast movement, a slow one, a minuet and trio, and then a finale. And the musical material we hear in those movements does not have to have anything to do with what we hear in other movements, but Beethoven joins those together. Of course, he's been doing it for a long time. If anybody has heard the first four movements of Symphony No. 5, you won't be surprised that you hear them at the end of the fourth movement too. But he does this more and more subtly, and more it becomes a very important structural element to the way he works out the architecture of his music. Now, never, not even in the first bars of Opus 1, does Beethoven concern himself too much with the comfort of the player. Anyone who's ever learned a Beethoven piano part will know that there will always be passages that are awkward. And the music you're going to hear today was considered so awkward, almost unplayable, by the first quartet that played it. It was led by a guy with a wonderful name, Ignaz Schappenzeig. And he said that this is so difficult. And Beethoven answered, this was a man who had given Beethoven free access to his string quartet so he could, have his music performed. He said, what do I care about your measly little fiddle when the spirit of the universe is talking to me? I guess if the spirit of the universe talks to you, you're privileged enough, you have the prerogative to do that. So we're looking at pieces also that were really intended for private audiences. A gathering like this in a public place was really not part of what the string quartet was invented for. It was invented for the edification and pleasure of the people playing it, and some of their friends who might come and listen to it. So this is where all of our great quartet composers, including Haydn and Mozart, strutted their stuff and stretched their imaginations. So Opus 130 in B-flat major, which I do not think is a coincidence that it's in this key, was composed in the late part of 1825 and the early part of 1826, when Beethoven quite clearly was already quite ill. It was premiered in March 1826 in the first version. Now, this is already something interesting. Very, very, very rarely does Beethoven make a change once the piece has been performed. Very, very significantly with his opera Fidelio. So this is an example of Beethoven changing his mind. I don't believe that it was changed for him. I think very, very likely he had already made up his mind. So in any case, the overall scheme of movements gives us 6 movements altogether. We have the opening movement, which I'll just talk in a little bit of detail in a few minutes, which is a good but very, very original, very innovative example of Sonata Allegro form. And again, I'll try to encapsulate that in as few words as possible. And then we have what we might call 2 pairs of movements, a scherzo and then a slow movement, another scherzo and then another slow movement. This is like 2 or 3 things happening at the same time. He's doubling the number of movements we expect to hear in between the opening movement and the finale. He's making them quite short on the whole, as if he's trying to evoke the feeling of a kind of Baroque suite. And also, he's, of course, creating 4 little kind of bagatelles, or short works, in between 2 outstandingly large ones. And we have the Gross Fruga. Now, I have to say just one quick thing about that before I go on, and that is this. Beethoven obviously thought this was a big deal, this piece, and it is certainly that. It's a 10-minute fugue of outstanding complexity and difficulty. Difficulty for the players, difficulty for the listeners. He was not at the first performance. Apparently he was at a cafe nearby, and he heard that 2 of the middle movements were encored. The audience liked them enough that they asked for them to be replayed. And he was furious because that didn't happen with the fugue. And he referred to the audience, such as it was, a small gathering of elite listeners, as cattle and asses, because they didn't ask for that work to be, that movement to be encored. So I think at that point he was already thinking, maybe I'll publish it separately. But in any case, they dispatched the youngest member of the quartet, the second violinist, whose name is Karl. I've written it down and now I can't find it. Karl Holtz, to go suggest to Beethoven. Now, this is kind of like sending your youngest child to go argue with the President of the United States, the former one, and convince him to do something or her to do something. And Beethoven was surprisingly complacent about it. So that would lead us to believe he'd probably already decided that he will publish this separately and write a different ending. Today you have the luxury of hearing both endings, both final movements. But it's very, very interesting to think, if you hear the original ending, where it was originally intended to be, it's a completely different piece. Even with the colossal nature of the first movement, it feels like everything is driving toward that fugue. And if you take the somewhat Hungarian folk-like music of the second finale, it focuses attention on one of the most beautiful pieces Beethoven ever wrote, one of the most beloved by him, the Cavatina, that comes right before the last movement. So just a few things about these movements, if you don't mind. So the first movement, as I said, is essentially a Sonata Allegro form. The whole idea behind Sonata Allegro form, I'm not going to give you an analysis of it, but basically it's a classical invention to offer us contrast between 2 things, 2 contrasting things, including 2 contrasting keys. And Beethoven takes this to the extreme. You're going to hear what will seem to be a slow introduction, and it begins unison. So Beethoven then will harmonize it and introduce counterpoint. In the first 8 bars, you hear pretty much everything that can be done with texture. 1 melody alone, some chords to support it, and some competing complementary counter melodies. And then this will alternate with the other thing that you can do, change tempo. So he then moves us into a quick tempo, and we're all used to that. We've heard it with Haydn, we've heard it with Mozart, we've heard it with earlier Beethoven. But he surprises us by bringing the slow material back again. And there's this kind of tension and dichotomy between those 2 extremes throughout the whole opening movement. One of the things is, you may not be absolutely aware of this, but if you've heard enough classical symphonies, I'm thinking right now of Haydn's 104th, when you get to the Allegro, that's where you stay. When the first part of the movement is repeated, you go back to the beginning of the Allegro. You do not go back to the whole slow movement or the whole slow introduction, but you do in this piece. So it's not a slow introduction at all. Even though our experience as classical music listeners might lead us to think it is, it's an integral part of the whole movement. And the idea of all of these extremes, including individual writing for the instruments, the idea of these playing off each other is one of the central ideas and issues of the whole movement. And one of my favorite writers about this said, essentially, Beethoven is testing the limits of musical language in this movement, everything we have learned. And then we have these 4 character pieces. Now, somebody who had been listening to music for a long time asked me what Scherzo means. So I'm going to tell you, it means joke. And Beethoven and Haydn liked to substitute the Scherzo and trio in place of the minuet and trio. The minuet's always elegant, and you can only go so fast. With the Scherzo, you can get down and dirty and really move that tempo. So we moved to a Scherzo and trio. An interesting thing is most people will expect the slow movement to come next. But don't forget, in the Ninth Symphony, Beethoven puts the Scherzo right after the first movement, too. Now, somebody else asked me, why is it called a trio? A ternary structure means a section of music is played, and then a contrasting section, and then you go back to the opening section again. You may change the instrumentation, you may change some dynamics, but that's what an ABA ternary structure is. The B section was called a trio because in the 17th century, a French composer named Lully literally alternated in between minuets a little passage of music that was played by 3 woodwind instruments. So it was called the trio. And even though that practice died many years ago, we still use that term. It's interesting, isn't it? And that guy was the one who killed himself by jabbing his walking stick through his shoe. So it's a very, very confusing world. So this is going to be a fantastic movement in B-flat minor, where we have this scurrying, sort of furtive figure that we'll hear. And it's contrasting with the B section that's described as wild bombast. And there's this feeling that you were not supposed to know where the beat is. It's confusing, slightly off-putting to the listener. But there's this one passage, please listen for it. It's described this way. The first violin, hovers 3 times above a moat of snapping crocodiles. And the snapping crocodiles are heard in the form of a semitone. The semitone is going to be a very important part of this music. The theme from Jaws, and a lot of late Beethoven. It has within it virtually the germ of any chromaticism and dissonance we might hear. So then we have a slowish movement. Beethoven liked to qualify, to hedge his bets when he told us how fast that the tempos were supposed to be. So the third movement is andante con molto ma non troppo poco scherzando. Would you like me to tell you what that means? It means essentially moving along but not too much and just a little bit jocular. And basically, this alternates between a lovely andante amoroso kind of melody with the mechanical evocation of a clock, which was quite popular at the time. Then we have a movement that's marked in your programs, alla tedesca. The word tedesca simply means in the German style. The French would have said allemande. And it's quick, and it's in 3/8. An 18th century composer and a 19th century composer would have known, if you know your time signatures, 3/8 will always be faster than 3/4. If you've all learned your theory, you know a quarter note weighs less than a half note and more than an eighth note. So it's meant to be moving very quickly. It's not meant to sound sophisticated. It's meant to have these false starts and misplaced beats, and it tests, in the words of that writer that I like so much, how much it's possible for music to make fun of itself. And then we will have the Cavatina. This is a really significant movement. If you played the Gross Fruga right afterwards, it still doesn't overshadow it. Cavatina is like an operatic aria. And that same young man, Kurt Holtz, said that Beethoven told him that that was the one piece he'd written that always made him cry when he thought about it, and it cost him tears to write it. It's an extraordinarily beautiful melody, but listen, even though the first violin has the melody, all the other instruments have what Haydn might have called obbligato accompaniment. Beethoven completely avoids the generic accompanying figure, da-dee-doo-doo, completely. They all have their own melodies. The only composer after that who I think does it that well is Brahms, if you listen to his chamber music. And it therefore is something that is incredibly beautiful. But then there's this very unsettling passage that leads me to understand why this piece was chosen for a certain purpose. And here's where we get the word beklempt, which means oppressed, anguished, stifled, in the way that we might feel in the air just before a thunderstorm. And this perhaps led Carl Sagan to choose it to be included in a recording that went up into space in the Voyager spacecraft in the 1970s. He wanted to create, for anybody in the future who ever found this, an idea of the best of human achievement. But at the same time, what he felt that captured was the deep sense of humility when we see pictures taken of the Earth from out in space, the tininess of the Earth. So it accomplishes both of those things. And now we have the finale. Now I said I'd say something about Die Grosse Fuge in a second, but this finale that Beethoven substituted for it, I think could not be more different. It has almost a rustic, peasanty kind of feel, and I'm not going to play any of it for you because the quartet will do that incomparably. But a young fellow who really liked this piece was Franz Schubert. And when you get to this fifth movement, the second finale, it might remind you of a piece that Schubert composed as the final movement of his final sonata, also in B flat. I'm going to just play a little bit of that. Light, playful, folk-like, incredibly perfect for the finale of this piece. Now, Die Grosse Fuge, as Stravinsky called it, eternally contemporary. A fugue is a genre of imitative counterpoint, but with way more rules than a round. And in this, Beethoven just finds every possible thing that you can do with a fugue. And I'm just going to play three motives that you'll hear at the beginning. They're all completely intertwined. And again, what you're going to hear is a little forest of semitones. So all of these wonderful... Those are very much part of the last four notes of a harmonic scale. If you ever spent hours preparing for Royal Conservatory piano exams and having to play harmonic minor scales, this is the payoff. All the potential for dissonance and chromaticism. And then Beethoven introduces these peculiar longer notes, I'll just call them. And then we get the fugue proper. Now, Beethoven is written at the top of this, tanto libre, tanto recherché, which means partly free and partly studied or learned. So I'll just play you the opening of this fugue, and then we'll turn you over to the Emily Carr String Quartet. I just really love that. And Beethoven must have known that people would take to that piece because he also wrote it for four hands at one piano. And it's devilishly hard to play. It rewards every bit of your attention throughout the whole journey. If this is your first time hearing it, you're going to have a magnificent, enjoyable, and life-changing experience. If it's your 100th time hearing it, it'll be even more enjoyable and even more life-changing. So thank you very much. Thanks for being here. And please join me in welcoming the one and only Emily Carr String Quartet.
Thank you.